Hi folks, it's Thinking Slow. Special welcome to anyone who's watching us on YouTube. They surprisingly reinstated us there, but even then our main focus is on Rumble, so if you have the option, please switch over to Rumble. What I wanted to talk about today is peace in Ukraine, because that's a subject the political class and the media absolutely won't touch with a barge pole. And what I wanted to describe today is really sort of two outline peace proposals that already existed, that are not covered anywhere in the media. Media is all about the minutiae of war and weapons and the money going into Ukraine, nothing about what could a settlement agreement look like. And I think that's important to discuss because it's clear that both sides really are losing very heavily in this war, so that there's no winner in any of this. There's only relative degrees of loss, and every day this goes on, it's really a catastrophe for everybody involved. And just to put a sort of one number out there, there's 19,000 shells a day being fired by Russia, and there's a sort of smaller number coming back being fired by Ukraine. And these numbers are completely mind-bending, and the level of destruction is beyond, I mean, it's total destruction, and therefore everybody should have an enormous imperative interest in actually facilitating any kind of peace agreement. And what we're seeing now is really the opposite of that. We're sort of tub-thumping warmongering is the order of the day for many in the political class and many in the media, and that's completely inappropriate, and that's why I wanted to talk about peace. So the first real outline proposal was in December 2021 from the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and there is a document that you can get a link to, which I'll provide below. I've tried to summarize what the main terms were. It was NATO non-expansion, non-deployment of strike weapons that are a threat to Russia, and returning military configurations to the 1997 Russia-NATO Founding Act. Now, the first two don't seem to be too outrageous. The third one involves quite a lot of nitty-gritty that's not worth going into at the moment, but the point is that there was a document being circulated before this war started. And I mean, I have slightly cherry-picked here the NATO response to that document, but this is a literal quote from Jens Stoltenberg in December 2021. And we will not compromise on the fact that NATO has a partnership agreement with Ukraine, which is important for us and Ukraine. Now, the two sides of the argument are basically Ukraine is a sovereign territory and has complete discretion to make its own security arrangements, whereas the Russian side is obviously expansion of NATO up to Russia's border is a threat to Russia. Now, you can sort of argue the toss quite a long time on those two things, but it was certainly known by both sides since at least 2008 that NATO expansion is going to cause tremendous friction. And actually in the 2019 RAND document that recommended militarizing Ukraine, they understood that there was a risk that that would eventually escalate into full-blown war. So no matter how many times the mainstream media uses the word unprovoked, this war, when it finally blew up in February 22, was provoked, and it was a clear set of red flags that were leading towards this conflict. But at this point, there was on the table a agreement for an accommodation, and it was an accommodation that recognizes the fact that US and UK are really the driving force behind this eastward expansion, and they had identified Russia as a strategic enemy, and therefore there needs to be a sort of realism that that was bound to clash in Ukraine. And the Russian proposal was to have Ukraine being essentially neutral and not having those weapons of attack on Ukrainian soil. So we then get to Istanbul in March, end of March 2022 and April 2022, And this was almost not reported anywhere in the Western press. What were the details of that communique? And the only real summary I could find of it was actually in the Russian press in TASS. And I've tried to put just a few bullet points down. And again, it seems not unreasonable. And the bullet points were: no weapons of mass destruction in Ukraine, non-aligned status and no foreign military bases in Ukraine, security guarantees from the countries on the UN Security Council plus 6 other countries for Ukraine. And that also included explicit acknowledgement that Ukraine was going to be or apply for EU membership, and Russia understood that and wouldn't take any steps to try and stop or delay that process. And there were also some de-escalation steps towards a ceasefire, which included withdrawing from western Ukraine and areas around Kiev. So in September 2022, President Putin went on record and said that essentially the parties had more or less agreed in Istanbul, and they had achieved more or less an agreed picture of those bullet points that we looked at in the last slide. And his version is that the West essentially instructed Ukraine to scupper those talks. And there's been increasingly now press articles confirming that point of view. Firstly, that it was Boris Johnson that delivered the message to destroy the Istanbul communique. And that same message now is coming out from multiple sources, although it's almost a year after those talks took place. This position is becoming more and more credible as more and more people say, yep, those talks were deliberately sabotaged. So the issue now is that despite the enormous psyops, the sort of endless Ukrainian flags, the standing ovations in Western parliaments, despite all of that and the amount of money that's been spent on pushing the propaganda, especially through the mainstream media, incredibly a very significant proportion of the population in most countries is against getting involved militarily in Ukraine. So, I mean, we're talking, roughly speaking, about 3/4 of the population. So a huge supermajority does not want to get involved militarily in the conflict. Now, there's all kinds of different ways of phrasing this question, but this is the phrasing in this survey, which was Ipsos from January 2023. So it's quite recent. So the politicians who continue with the warmongering must know, or they do know, that somewhere in the order of 3/4 of the population of all of these countries do not want to get involved militarily. So further escalation is not something that's supported by the population. Now, there are other items which are supported about humanitarian aid and lots of other questions in this survey, but this is the one in particular that I've chosen, which is getting involved militarily, and there's no appetite for that amongst the population of all of these countries. And the average level across 28 countries is 71% say that we should avoid getting involved militarily in the conflict. So, I mean, we also did a little Twitter poll, which is obviously biased to whoever could see it. It's only 650 votes, but again, the message is quite clear. Stop sending weapons, or, you know, at best link those weapons to peace agreements. And every announcement I've seen from the UK ministers saying, good news, we're sending more weaponry, is met with almost universal disapproval in the replies section underneath those announcements. Now, one of the issues is the sort of Western NGO deep state complex does have a number of highly aggressive warmongers in those groups, and one of the most aggressive is Ben Hodges, who until recently was in SEPA, which we'll talk about, but his view through Twitter is stated as really the destruction of Russia and breaking it up into constituent pieces. So the Russian side will see this conflict as an existential threat because they recognize there are plenty of warmongers like Ben Hodges that actually want to not just regime change Russia, and there's a big question about what rights they have to demand regime change in Russia, but they actually want to break Russia up. So this is an existential threat for Russia, and of course this will this will double down on their determination to fight this. And just talking about the policy making side on the West, I think people have seen several films we've done about the terrible conflicts of interest between the NGOs that generally have a very significant input into foreign policy in the US. I actually think they probably write foreign policy, and the politicians may be there to sort of present it to the public. But Green is just a sample of several of these NGOs that are involved in foreign policy development. And then behind them is the funding, the funders. So purple is regular corporations, and some of those will be dual-use corporations as well. But the red is the outright defense contractors. So Ben Hodges, for example, was in SEPA, which is this one, and until recently was being paid $200,000 a year. And SEPA then in turn is funded, as you can see, by General Dynamics, BAE Systems, and Lockheed Martin. That's the three red circles around here feeding into that. So I think he's terribly conflicted by pushing a war, which of course generates more revenue for exactly the funders of SEPA. I don't like this setup at all. I think it's dishonest. It's certainly open to bad conflicts of interest, but unfortunately guys like this are deep in the policy making circles in the US, and I think that's a reason why you're seeing policy which is very much at odds with the interests of the people. And the interests of the people, forever and all time has always been peace. No right-minded population ever wants to go to war, and that's borne out by the surveys. So this is another reason you're not seeing any serious consideration or discussion of those peace arrangements. So where do we go from here, essentially? This is slightly selective, but these could be three ways forward. So we could actually have this Ukrainian neutrality and some kind of autonomy for eastern Ukraine, and that was presented in the Russian proposals from December 2021, and more or less repeated in the Istanbul communique. And the Istanbul communique is a great document. If it could be resurrected and implemented, that really is the way out of this. The other option is Russia continues to fight to the last Ukrainian, and Russia does have a superiority in all kinds of weapons and in numbers, obviously. Now, what could happen is what's happening now is the Ukrainians can fight sort of heroically and get to a standstill position, but they're facing very bad odds in terms of sort of hardware. And we're actually going to talk to a specialist about this later today. But the other point about the Ukrainians is they have a demographic, major demographic issue that no one's talking about, is that they have very few people, young males in the military age. In one age group, they have about 70,000. I think it's in the category of 24. And the reason for that is the birth rate sort of collapsed post breakup of the Soviet Union. So when you're hearing numbers of 100,000, 200,000, who knows how many deaths, you have to put that within the context of a very relatively small number of fighting men in those age groups because of the collapse in fertility post breakup of the Soviet Union. So, when you have 70,000 altogether aged, I think it is 24, and you're losing hundreds of thousands now, you really are wiping out a generation, essentially, and it just can't go on. With Ukraine, I have no idea how it's going to recover from this. And then, of course, the last point is if the West is sort of half in, it's effectively de facto at war, but it's not fully at war. And of course, if it does engage directly, which is probably the only way to sort of achieve the aims of the likes of Ben Hodges, which is really to destroy Russia, then of course for the Russian side it becomes a no-loss situation where they'll move to full World War III. And although they get accused of saber rattling over nuclear, the first nuclear saber rattling was the US Senator Wicker in December 2021, who was talking about first strikes on Russia long before anyone else mentioned nuclear strikes. But the field commanders have said on the Russian side, let's use tactical nuclear weapons and save the lives of Russian soldiers. So there's definitely a school of thought inside Russia that would move to that, and that's where this goes. If NATO engages, it becomes existential. There's of course other theoretical outcomes, including a coup in Russia, which is really what the West wanted, which hasn't happened. The more the Russians understand the mentality of guys, warmongers like Ben Hodges, the less likely you're going to see of any kind of coup in Russia, and actually you're going to see further determination and consolidation of power around Putin. So, of these three options, of course, only one really makes any sense, which is, to agree something and stop the killing. And that's before getting into the 100+ billion, that's even up to November, that have been poured into this. That kind of money politicians talk about as a percentage of GDP, because they don't really get real numbers. But just in the UK, the £6 billion that have been put in from the UK side, excluding humanitarian aid, this is $6 billion in financial and military. That's enough to build over 22,000 starter homes in the UK. I mean, that's the kind of money we're talking about, as well as the incredible loss of life on the Ukrainian and the Russian side. So anybody in their right mind, I suggest, would want to reinvigorate those Istanbul agreements and actually get them signed and get to a ceasefire position as soon as possible, because the alternative is either just more killing and more or less endlessly, or escalation into something that easily, it probably will turn into World War III. So that's what I wanted to say today. If you look at this and you find it annoying, please contact your MPs. As flawed as that system is, it's the only one out there. And I think at this stage they must realize, a lot of these parliamentarians and a lot of people in government, they are out on a limb. They're really, despite the psyops, there isn't the support for escalating this conflict. And please write to them and say, look, make some efforts to work on peace, reinvigorate the Istanbul agreement, and let's put a stop to this killing and destruction as soon as possible. Hope you found this interesting, and please think about subscribing and helping us out through the Patreon system. Thank you. Bye.